Hormuz sits like a narrow throat between two great bodies of water, and for weeks now it has been the single most dangerous place on Earth. What began in late February as a swift and devastating campaign against Iran has widened into a regional crisis that threatens not just soldiers and sailors, but the global flow of fuel, food, and manufactured goods. Fragile truce took hold in early April, yet this week that truce was tested in ways that make the phrase temporary ceasefire feel dangerously inadequate. On April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week pause in direct attacks, a pause that was meant to create breathing room for diplomacy. Negotiators met in Pakistan and both sides exchanged proposals intended to turn a halt in the shooting into a broader end to the war. But the ceasefire did not erase the strategic leverage Iran holds in the Gulf, control over the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne. The question has remained painfully simple. Who will control that waterway and at what cost? On the first week of May, the United States announced an operation it said was designed to answer precisely that question. President Donald Trump called the plan Project Freedom, a U.S. military and diplomatic effort to guide stranded commercial vessels safely through an enhanced security area south of the strait. The aim, USO report, officials said, was humanitarian, to unblock hundreds, possibly thousands of ships that have been effectively trapped since the war began. President Donald Trump said *neutral and innocent countries have been affected by the Iran war, and we have told these countries that we will guide their ships safely out of these restricted waterways so that they can freely and ably get on with their business. Aspect that one post on social media changed the calculus on the water. Within hours, US guided missile destroyers were steaming through the northern approaches, accompanied by aircraft, helicopters, and an array of unmanned systems. Central Command described a layered security posture that would support merchant captains who volunteered to transit, while urging other commercial operators to stand by until routes and insurance could be confirmed. CENTCOM also issued a short, categorical statement about what happened on Project Freedom's opening day. U.S. Central Command said 2 commercial ships flying the American flag have successfully transited the Strait of Hormuz. But the same day that the US celebrated those initial transits, Iran struck back in a manner certain to test how long a pause in the fighting can endure. The United Arab Emirates reported a barrage of missiles and drones fired from Iranian territory, and officials in the Emirate of Fujairah said a drone strike sparked a large fire at a petroleum industrial zone, injuring 3 Indian nationals. UAE air defenses, the government said, engaged multiple incoming missiles and drones and managed to intercept several of them. Across the strait, US commanders described a different set of threats: cruise missiles, attack drones, and multiple small, fast boats converging on American warships and the commercial vessels they were protecting. 2 US destroyers, the USS Trojane and the USS Mason, transited the Strait of Hormuz under that protective screen, and according to US military officials, met a coordinated attack. By late afternoon, Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of US military, Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of USS Cavades, Central Command told reporters that US forces had intercepted missiles and drones and had struck back at hostile small craft. His tally described 6 Iranian fast boats that had attempted to interfere with commercial shipping, helicopters and other platforms engaging in neutralizing those threats. President Trump, posting later, put the number at 7. President Donald Trump said *KA. Shot down 7 small boats, or as they like to call them, fast boats. There is a discrepancy in the counts. CENTCOM described 6 boats, while the president reported 7. And that difference matters because it points to how quickly fog and friction can turn an operational detail into a political argument. Iranian and allied state media offered a starkly different account, alleging that civilian cargo vessels or even passenger boats had been struck and that lives were lost. Tehran insisted the US AIM-1 passenger boats had been struck and had violated the ceasefire with aggressive moves in the strait and warned that any further incursions would be met with force. In short, both sides were telling versions of events that served their strategic narratives. At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff briefed reporters and pushed an argument one of them summarized plainly. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said, "The ceasefire is not over." That line, short. Emphatic was meant to do 2 things at once. It reassured allies and domestic audiences that diplomacy still mattered, and it drew a very narrow line around acceptable levels of Iranian activity. Hegseth and his generals framed Project Freedom as an effort to restore commerce and humanitarian normalcy, while insisting they were prepared to escalate if Iran crossed thresholds set by the White House. In other words, they would tolerate punctuated attacks so long as the truce, in the judgment of Washington, held. But tolerance has limits, and the geographical reality is brutal. The Strait of Hormuz is wide enough to admit tankers and tight enough that a single drone, a single mine, or a single fast boat can change the whole picture. Oil traders and finance desks reacted immediately. On the day U.S. forces moved to reopen the channel, global oil prices spiked and stock markets wavered. Commentators and analysts thinking through supply chains and retail pumps warn that U.S. average G as align prices, already elevated by months of disruption, could climb toward $5 a gallon if the strait stayed closed for an extended period. That scenario was repeatedly framed in reporting and on trading floors as a realistic risk, a downstream consequence felt in families and businesses far from the Gulf. Behind the military and financial headlines is a human ledger of displacement, death and damage that predates Project Freedom. The conflict has killed thousands across the region since the U.S. and Israel's strikes at the end of February, uprooting civilians, wrecking infrastructure, and forcing nations to balance solidarity with self-interest. Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, quietly pushed the United States both to act and to avoid setting the region ablaze. Other foreign powers, including China and Russia, weighed in diplomatically at the United Nations, where efforts to pass binding resolutions have already foundered against vetoes and competing strategic priority. So on the diplomatic track, Iran this week circulated a 14-point proposal it said was a path to peace aimed, it said, at ending the war, rather than merely stretching out the ceasefire. The White House responded according to Tehran with its own counter-proposal. President Trump, however, signaled skepticism, telling interviewers and posting on social media that Tehran had not paid a sufficiently steep price for its actions to merit a deal. The gulf between those positions, between Iran's calculus about the value of controlling the strait and Washington's determination to deny it, that leverage is what negotiators attempted to bridge in Islamabad and in shuttle diplomacy across capitals. For mariners, insurers, and shipping companies, words and war translate into immediate operational choices. Hundreds of vessels remain anchored or laid up in nearby ports, crews unpaid or cut off. Insurance premiums for transits across the Gulf have risen sharply, and many commercial captains welcome. Feign not risk their hulls or their people without clear commitments from governments. Project Freedom sought to offer that commitment, pairing military assets with a coordination cell designed to clear routes, package intelligence, and in some cases physically shepherd ships out of danger. But the operation also raises legal and political questions. Who pays for escort? On what authority do U.S. ships operate so close to Iranian territorial waters? And how will third-party nations from South Korea to Greece to India choose whether to join or stand aside? President Trump, addressing the standoff and urging allies to cooperate, made one of his most brazen appeals directly to Seoul. President Donald Trump said perhaps it's time for South Korea to come and join the mission. That appeal reflects a wider strategic gamble. By internationalizing the mission and framing Project Freedom as a defense of neutral commerce rather than a unilateral show of force, Washington aims to collect allies and dilute Tehran's claims of American aggression. It also places a burden on countries whose nationals and companies dominate shipping and who are wary of being pulled into an expanding war. The immediate, frightening calculus of the past 72 hours is simple. Iran and its proxies have shown they can strike at shipping and at coastal infrastructure across the Gulf. The UAE, one of America's closest partners in the region, managed to intercept many of the incoming missiles and drones on Monday and reported only 3 moderate injuries in Fujairah. The United States and its forces, meanwhile, demonstrated they can and will use overwhelming technology, helicopters, destroyers, interceptors, to protect designated transits. When the two sides collide during such operations, the risk is that errors, misinterpretations, and the fog of war will turn tactical actions into strategic escalation. That is not an abstract worry. On the first day of Project Freedom, U.S. forces in Iran, Iran units traded claims and counterclaims about who fired at whom and what was hit. CENTCOM was unequivocal in its operational messages. No U.S. Navy ships were struck, 2 American-flagged merchant ships transited, and hostile small craft were neutralized. Tehran's outlets, by contrast, accused the United States of attacking civilian boats and insisted that Iran retained the right to police the strait and to collect fees it says compensate for damage. Outside, the immediate combatants, a chorus of diplomats and international institutions, raised their hands for de-escalation. The United Nations, faced with competing drafts, moved to threaten sanctions should Iran prevent freedom of navigation or fail to disclose mines and obstructions. Gulf states reacted publicly and privately, emphasizing the need to protect commercial infrastructure while declining to be swept into a broader conflagration. The European Union and other partners called for restraint and urged renewed, serious negotiated ions to convert a pause into an actual peace. Amid the noise and the launches, the human stories feel both urgent and distant. Sailors counted the hours on the bridges of blocked tankers. Port workers watched cranes idle. Families checked gas prices and grocery bills, uncertain how the breakdown of supply chains halfway across the world might touch their lives at home. For the United States and Iran, for the UAE and South Korea and dozens of other states with ships and citizens in harm's way, those cascading consequences make every intercepted missile or downed drone a political act with immediate economic repercussions. In the near term, the calculus will be messy and mobile. Washington insists it wants to enforce a safe corridor, but senior U.S. leaders and the president himself have made clear that the decision to restart full combat operations would be theirs alone. Tehran, for its part, has signaled it will respond to what it views as violations of the truce and Iranian poly. Finitico leaders have tied reopening the strait to concessions on sanctions and the U.S. naval blockade. The result is a brittle stalemate. Both sides possess the means to inflict severe damage, and both are aware that a single misfire could spiral into something much wider. As a practical matter, the fate of Project Freedom and of the ceasefire itself will hinge on 3 things. First, the capacity of naval coordination cells and intelligence layers to prevent misidentification and to enable quick, transparent deconfliction. Second, the willingness of neutral flag states and the maritime insurance industry to accept U.S. guarantees and to resume normal transits. And third, the political stamina of negotiators in Islamabad and elsewhere to translate temporary breathing room into enforceable agreements that address Iran's strategic concerns while restoring commerce. For listeners today, there is a simple, urgent takeaway. A narrow channel of water has become a global pressure point. What plays out in the Strait of Hormuz over the coming days will affect wallets, jobs, and the geopolitical balance for months to come. Military postures can protect a corridor for a time, but they do not by themselves resolve the grievances that led to this war. Only diplomacy, painfully, imperfectly, and persistently pursued, can produce the longer peace that will allow tankers to move without escorts, insurers to lower premiums, and prices at the pump to retreat from the sharp edge of uncertainty. The scene in the Gulf remains volatile. Ships patrolling, satellites watching, negotiators talking, and ordinary people around the world watching markets and hoping that power does not outpace prudence. The ceasefire may still be in effect on paper, but the strains are real and the choices are stark. In this moment of smoke and signal, the next act will be decided not only by sailors and pilots, but by those in rooms who must choose whether to return to the table to shave away the obstar. Pleas to an agreement or to let the current standoff harden into something far more costly. We will continue to follow developments closely to track the movement of ships, the decisions of diplomats, and the human consequences that ripple from a single narrow waterway. For now, the strait remains a test of military restraint, of political judgment, and of the international system's ability to keep the lights on for a global economy that depends on a single fragile passage.